Well, welcome everyone. As everybody kind of trickles in, I just wanted to go ahead and take a moment and welcome everyone to our new Ptarmigan 2024-2025 mini lecture series. We're all very excited to have you. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. And for those of you who are now kind of veterans of the series, welcome back. Before we get started, I just wanted to make a quick note that all of our previous recordings and lectures are available on our website at ptarmigan.stanford.edu. If you have any questions, you can easily reply to the email that you had to register for this webinar, and the email comes straight to me, and I can forward you any and all kind of relevant information. Without any further ado, though, I did want to say today we are very excited to welcome Julia Lillis. Today, Professor Lillis, who is an assistant professor at Union Theological Seminary, will be presenting on virginity. Her research is broadly concerned with ancient constructions of social difference, really kind of grappling with definitions of gender and sexuality. So without further ado, Professor Lillis, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. I wanted to say that I'm grateful to Anuj and Michael and everybody working to make this series happen. And it's also a delight to be with a broad audience, not just experts, but also the uninitiated. I hope that the talk is useful for all involved. Tonight, instead of slides, I'm going to periodically pull up a simple bit of outline content to show where we are in the structure. This first section starts us in the present with virginity's meaning, significance, and value. The second section is sources and scholarship on ancient virginity. And third is fruitful areas that scholars have been working on. So first, starting with the present. Virginity is a topic many people know a lot about, or we think we do. The term may make us think about a community's premarital expectations, like saving sex for marriage, or a religious vocation, temporarily or permanently renouncing sex, or of more general expressions for transitions, including calling somebody about to do anything for the first time a whatever that thing is virgin. Lay people, leaders, and scholars have had a lot to say about virginity, especially women's virginity, in the ancient Mediterranean world and today. Its meaning and importance can seem so self-evident that major conversations about it take place without pressure to define one's terms or defend one's assumptions. We don't have to look far to find people treating women's virginity as something inherently significant and terribly valuable. When young women in North America occasionally announced plans to auction off their virginity in sex work in the early 2000s and 2010s, news stories reported bids of thousands or even millions of dollars. Vaginal tightening creams marketed in South Asia, cosmetic surgeries in Western medical settings offer customers the chance to feel more virginal. In 2018, the World Health Organization recommended a ban on virginity testing, citing at least two main methods meant to verify sexual status. Such tests had been reported in every corner of the globe for purposes as diverse as marriage arrangements and job screening, sexual violence lawsuits, HIV prevention, and protection of traditional culture for Indigenous and minority groups. We can turn to other exchanges to see virginity's meanings go without saying. Roman Catholic documents from 2018 discuss the vocation of consecrated virgins, lay women with ordinary careers who betrothed themselves to Christ. A passage in a text from the Vatican says that physical integrity might not be an essential prerequisite for all women called to this path. The United States Association of Consecrated Virgins disagreed, issuing a statement that insists on the importance of physical virginity. Readers of both texts are expected to know already what physical virginity is. It's not explained. Perhaps it simply means not having had forms of sex that would make one no longer sexually virginal, whatever those forms of sex are. Perhaps it means an untouched vagina, or reflects a common belief that in virgins, the hymen tissue that partly lines the vagina is noticeably intact. Meanwhile, virginity remains a popular theme in fiction and teen movies. Writers can play with its ambiguity for critique or humor, as when a character in the movie Mean Girls says, "I gave him everything. I was half a virgin when I met him." Ancient sources and scholarly works are sometimes just as vague. A passage in the Talmud says a virgin fit to marry a high priest would need to have all her virginity signs. Early Christian authors weighed in on debates about the Virgin Mary's virginity without checking if everyone else meant the same thing by the term. Patristic writers, traditionally labeled church fathers, say that true Christian virginity differs from virginity as it's usually understood. They don't explain what they think the popular meanings are for key terms like integrity and corruption. More broadly, virginity terms in ancient texts don't always refer to sexual inexperience. They sometimes point to age or marital or reproductive status, distinguishing teenagers from adults, maidens from married women, or wives without children from wives who are mothers, leaving readers to figure out which usage applies. Academic writers often rely on readers' prior knowledge in our own discussions of virginity. So what can we know about virginity in the ancient world? This second short section that I'm moving to next is the one on just a bit of background on pertinent sources. Here and in the third section, I give special attention to early Christian sources as the ones that I work with most deeply. The range of materials for studying virginity is large. For those specializing in Mediterranean regions, it can include everything from literature to visual art to grave inscriptions. Informative passages in law collections and medical texts are scattered across the Mediterranean world and Middle East for some ancient periods. Virgins and virginity are discussed in plays and poems and references to wedding rituals. For the early Common Era, we get glimpses of ideas people found familiar, plausible, or controversial when we read historical stories, rhetorical exercises, or romance novels. And yes, those were a thing. Jewish and Christian materials become increasingly abundant. Virgins feature in stories about saints and martyrs told in over a dozen languages. Aspects of virginity get deliberated in interpreting biblical texts. 4th century Christians wrote whole treatises with titles like On Virginity that map out rich theological ideas and precise behavioral ideals for those dedicated to lifelong celibacy. Hymns and sermons, argumentative texts, and literature for guiding monastic life of monks and nuns reveal dynamic thinking on what virginity means for Christian life and for understanding what one can about Christ and Mary or the nature of God. These varied sources show that many societies thought respectable women should be sexually virginal when they married, and that virginity was sometimes thought to be ritually or spiritually powerful. The range of disciplines for studying ancient virginity is likewise large and varied. Publications come from scholars of ancient Mesopotamian texts and Middle Eastern studies, ancient medicine, biblical and non-canonical studies, classics, rabbinics, patristics, more subfields of early Jewish or Christian or Byzantine studies, and language-specific circles like Syriac studies, as well as history and late antiquity circles. Early sources become important for theologians and for historians and theorists of gender and sexuality. Late ancient texts made frequent cameos in books by medievalists and in works for popular audiences. Diverse fields meet in academic conversations on virginity. A wave of projects in the 1990s and 2000s took cues from the social sciences and from groundbreaking studies by classicists. Scholars of past periods engaged with explanations for virginity's value rooted in paternity and inheritance concerns, in gender relations, or in economic, psychological, or sociological drivers. They noted that virginity can be understood in competing ways, redefined to suit ancient and medieval agendas, or transformed to suit diverse experiences of sexual debut today. They engaged with works by Julia Sissa, a classicist, that argue only some ancient groups, not all ancient groups, believed virgins have a vaginal membrane or hymen prior to penetration. At the same time, many scholars within and beyond early Christian studies continued assuming that Christians believed this from the start, or that any who seemed not to were going against the grain of traditional knowledge held by midwives or by Jewish or Roman neighbors. Studies in the 2010s and 2020s have built on these investigations and further challenged common assumptions. Divergences of practice and thought are now visible within a religious or geographic group, as well as between traditions or groups. New dissertations and monographs continue to appear. Hint, hint, graduate students, there's room for more. The topics for my third longer section are areas that have been very productive for scholars. Just going to show those for a moment. Areas include gender, proof, bodies, agendas, speculation. So these are the 5 topics I've organized some things underneath for this longest main section tonight. So first, gender. Most attention goes to women's virginity in ancient sources and in scholarship, but men's virginity has interested people too. One might mistakenly think the tendency to focus on women is because of factual biological differences rather than cultural convention. Many today believe that people who have vaginas have empirical evidence of virginity built into their bodies. But as I'll discuss soon, that evidence had to get invented. It's not obvious or reliable or subscribed to by all societies. People can, and occasionally do, devise ways to prove male virginity, and they could have invented virginity signs for men's bodies more often if there was more motivation to do so. Scholars usually analyze men's virginity in ancient sources as something appropriated, taken and adapted from women's virginity. A frequently quoted line from a 2nd century novel shows a male hero trying to seem more chaste than he is. He tells people that in his relationship, so far with the heroine he loves, he is a virgin, quote, if one can speak of such a thing as male virginity. Given other sexual activity in the story, this seems like a sly statement and maybe a joke. It's typically quoted to demonstrate men's virginity wasn't a thing in the Greco-Roman world. But some sources arguably make men's and women's experiences a bit more symmetrical, or show writers like this one critically and creatively engaging with existing virginity discourse to develop characters and storylines. Other writers could creatively shape regulations for communities that valued male celibacy or men's premarital virginity. There are some short studies on virginity for ancient men. Points of focus include grave inscriptions highlighting male virginity, biblical interpretation highlighting male virginal figures, or agendas of Christian leaders who talked about female virginity to work out issues that were really or also about male leaders, celibacy, and credibility. Some Christian writings on life as a monk apply virginity terms to men. A scholar who's written about early Jewish ideas on female virginity signs and ideals for male sexual roles is also exploring how sources address men's virginity. These are some of the angles from which late ancient male virginity comes into view. Girls' and women's virginity continues to be a major topic for studying the past and for wrestling with gendered sexual norms today. Again, in antiquity, virgin was most often a female label, but was used variously to designate an age group. Virgins are younger than women. Sexual status, virgins have not had sex. Marital status, virgins have not gotten married. Or sometimes reproductive status, virgins have not had kids. Some of these could overlap, and more connotations were added, like Roman virgins being marriageable citizens, or earlier Greek virgins embodying humans' untamed nature that needs to be civilized and guided carefully towards service to the state. Feminist concerns inspire abundant scholarship on Christian female virginity. Some studies bring out the liberating potential of lifelong virginity, like opportunities to engage in study, travel, and spiritual priorities instead of household management. Even conservative early church leaders liked to claim that virginity frees women from the burden of a husband's authority and difficulties of childbearing. Early saints, like a figure named Thecla, seemed to exercise greater teaching authority and remarkable powers because of devotion to God through virginity. Other feminist studies emphasize that late ancient writers worked swiftly to bring virgins under the authority of bishops and other male clergy, capitalizing on virgins' spiritual and symbolic power and tightly regulating their behaviors. Virginity could become just another route for patriarchal control. Some studies foreground diverse models for where and how virgins lived, or showed divergent trajectories. Some where virgins are ultimate models of human likeness to God, and others where they are proper brides of God with traditional feminine virtues. Many studies note the ways male leaders sought to limit virgins' activities or enforce strict expectations, while still showing possible benefits and forms of power associated with female virginity. Last in this section, virginity is also a fruitful area for thinking outside the box about gender and sexuality, and considering categories that are less binary or less permanent. Present-day health and social sciences examine experiences of virginity loss beyond traditional coitus and heterosexual norms. Some recent North American generations saw the concept of virginity as mainly relevant for hetero cisgender couples, but more recently, virginity sometimes gets queered or refashioned to fit more types of relationships and transitions. In some ancient contexts, people who were virgins were not exactly men or women, or not yet full-fledged ones. Non-virginal statuses like being an adult, married, sexually active, procreative were central to what it traditionally meant to be a woman or man. Because of this, groups endorsing celibacy, as many Christians did, could see virginity as a differently gendered or less gendered state. There's some overlap with eunuchs, who were also members of the social landscape, and likewise did not fit neatly into binary categories. Early Christian authors writing in Greek often convey that lifelong virginity is particularly holy because it most closely resembles divine sexlessness. This is sexlessness in both senses. According to traditional theology, God is above sexual activity and beyond having a sex or gender. Humans were expected not to need marriage or reproduction in the resurrected age to come. Ascetic Christians, who practiced strict disciplines and renounced societal roles, pleasures, and sexual obligations assigned to their gender, were said to be starting that angelic way of life early. As virgins practiced celibacy and asceticism, there was more than one way they or those around them could interpret their gendered or maybe progressively less gendered state. This area intersects with current research I'm doing on whether some early Christians could imagine being human without having gender. The next area here in my list is proof. This one needs a little bit of a content warning. I'm going to get more graphic about body parts than I already did. Efforts to prove, test, or simply demonstrate and advertise sexual virginity show up in many cultures of different times and places. Not all societies have cared about premarital virginity, but those that do sometimes develop ways to prove whether people are staying chaste enough, or ways to test the purity needed for a special ritual or religious role. In ancient Mediterranean and Middle Eastern contexts, most of the methods people dreamed up to test virginity, marital fidelity, or special purity were oaths, verbal testimony, or ordeals. Someone could swear to tell the truth, could have others investigate their character through witnesses' testimony, or could use wedding symbols that proclaimed their virginity, like wearing the right color or hairstyle, or distributing festive foods that guests later could testify had been served. In novels and in accounts about Vestal virgins, virginity can be tested by ordeal. An accused woman is put into a diagnostic situation or dangerous situation that invites gods, animals, rivers, or other forces to confirm the truth about their status through rescue or through an anticipated sign. In rarer instances, ancient sources point to bodily evidence of virginity. A very early example is a passage in the biblical book Deuteronomy, where a new bride can defend against a husband's accusation by providing evidence of her virginity to community elders. This might be a cloth that shows bleeding occurred during sex on the wedding night, though other interpretations have been proposed. While no hymenal barricade for wombs or vaginas appears in Jewish sources until the 4th or 5th century CE, some texts of the earlier Common Era treat coital bleeding as proof of premarital virginity. A few previous Greek and Latin texts hint that a girl's voice quality or neck size changes with virginity loss, perhaps reflecting an idea that sex causes parallel changes in lower and upper parts of the body. A tiny handful of 2nd and 3rd century CE sources show the notion of a hymenal barrier beginning to emerge in pagan Roman circles and Roman North African Christian circles. In late antiquity, around the turn to the 5th century and afterward, much more evidence appears for the belief that women's bodies show whether they are unpenetrated virgins. Now, modern readers are so accustomed to the idea of bodily proof that it's hard for many of us to imagine past cultures not having it. According to popular knowledge and some previous medical thinking, vaginas are fairly well obstructed by hymen tissue until penetration or trauma or intense athleticism damages the tissue. Sexual intercourse is thought to automatically and permanently alter it in a way medical experts can observe after the fact. But today's health sciences increasingly teach something different. Hymen tissue comes in multiple shapes and sizes. It varies in resilience at different stages of life. It may not break during penetration and occasionally might heal, especially in young people. Without prior photos for comparison, a doctor can only identify pronounced injury or very recent changes. Hymen tissue has no clear biological function and may simply be a byproduct of growing a vagina. This modified picture makes it easier to understand how ancient people who had or saw or medically treated vaginas could see hymen tissue as an unremarkable genital feature instead of a body part of its own that's loaded with meaning and forensic information. Most ancient medical works that discuss reproductive anatomy do not mention hymens, and some offer other explanations for the light bleeding associated with virginity loss. Only in the Common Era did physicians begin to mention and debate the notion of a hymen, and the debate continued into the modern period. Something that I've emphasized in my research is the tendency to misread sources when we read them through the lens of later assumptions and practices about this. Since late ancient and medieval and modern sources sometimes talk about hymens, vaginal narrowness, coital bleeding, or tests where experts like midwives can check if someone's still virginal, these things often get superimposed on early sources that are actually ambiguous or that discuss fertility, not virginity. If we reverse our expectations and figure that we're not encountering later beliefs unless sources show otherwise, we catch more possibilities for what ancient folks believed or did. And we catch more dimensions of the ideas that writers were working out. Another emphasis is the diverse forms that ideas about proof and perceptibility take. On the one hand, I think there was a widespread shift in late antiquity into a new common sense. It became common sense knowledge in quotation marks, that women's bodies show whether they're virginal. But on the other hand, late ancient people didn't all assume the same things about how bodies show this. You do find overlaps. Scholarly pagan works start to mention anatomical vaginal meanings for the term hymen alongside its previous meanings. And Christians are starting to claim that virgins have closed wombs and Christ was born without opening Mary's. Church leaders mention virginity inspections by midwives. All these things can fit together. But you also find a way to test virginity using urine. That's the earliest method in surviving medical sources, urine-based tests. And medical sources hardly ever offer ways to test virginity. While the first medical text to mention a virginal hymen argues that no such barricade exists, the first one to incorporate it is a 7th century medical commentary that locates the barrier at the cervix, the opening to the uterus, rather than the vagina. Rabbinic Jewish sources like the Talmuds have passages that still discuss bleeding as a sign, and others that imply virgins have a barrier or a distinctively narrow vaginal shape. Moreover, there are clues that people had reasons besides proof when they treated virginity as a noticeable or desirable genital state. In late antiquity, collections of pharmaceutical-like recipes started including ways to make vaginas seem more virginal. There had been recipe collections like this for a long time, but having these virginity-related ones was new. The steps use ingredients that would dry out or temporarily tighten tissue. One recipe is intended for survivors of violence, maybe to mask their history, possibly also for their own sense of healing. One or two are for getting pregnant more easily by mimicking qualities of virgins' organs, like dryness or narrowness. A couple recipes just say the woman will be like a virgin or like a virgin during sex. Perhaps these are meant for spouses or sex workers. They don't say which of the two partners will appreciate the difference. So it seems that by very late antiquity, lots of people in Mediterranean societies believed virgins have noticeably virginal vaginas, yet they didn't all expect to find the same features and didn't try to prove virginity the same way when they tried to at all. Even when there's pronounced historical shifts in ideas about virginity over time, there's also ongoing variety in any time or place. Our next section here is bodies. Now, you would probably think that that last graphic section was all that needs to be said about late ancient virgins' bodies, but there's so much more to say. Here are a couple of other matters that scholars are thinking about lately with so-called bodily virginity. First, some of us want to get more precise in naming those diverse ways that late ancient people made virginity physical. One way that I've tried out is labeling ideas anatomical when they concern the body's structures and shapes, and physiological when they concern the body's fluids and functions. Anatomy is stuff the body may have, like hymen tissue. Physiology is stuff the body may do, like bleed or hurt. Other scholars will probably add or refine or change these categories. The point is that not all bodily ideas are the same. We've also steered toward greater precision about debates ancient thinkers had and where the competing views clash. For a long time, we would see sources that say virginity is more than just an untouched body, or that contrast virginity of body with virginity of soul, and figure a familiar debate was happening over and over across history: physical virginity versus mental or spiritual virginity. But it's not the exact same debate if people in different cultures understand bodies and souls themselves differently from each other, or if ancient thinkers have different definitions for bodily virginity. In terms of where tensions arise or competing views clash, it no longer looks like all Romans thought one way, or all Christians or Jews thought one way in contrast to each other. There wasn't even just one group that invented and spread the idea of hymens, or that initiated the turn toward thinking of virginity as perceptible. This seems to have been more of a larger joint effort, maybe a largely unconscious development where multiple traditions and regions played a part. Several studies identify different meanings for virginity inside a tradition or a region. The thinking doesn't follow a progressive line in just one direction across a period either. It's more like people pick up or make up the meanings that they need for their present purposes. On top of this, virginity terms can mean different things in different parts of the Bible, or different comedies by the same Roman playwright, or different parts of a Christian story about Mary. In patristic works, competing impulses sometimes clash within the reasoning of a single author. Famous Latin writers like Ambrose of Milan and Augustine of Hippo tend to draw together multiple agendas and definitions for virginity, creating unresolved tensions inside their own thought. Third, I'll give an example of how writers of a shared time and place can diverge in their meanings for virginity of the body. A Greek-writing Christian author named Basil of Ankara lived in the mid-4th century in what's now Turkey, then Asia Minor. He's not very famous today, but he wrote a treatise called True Incorruption in Virginity that circulated widely. A better-known author, Gregory of Nyssa, was a younger contemporary who lived into the very late 4th century, also wrote in Greek, also lived in Asia Minor. Early in his career, Gregory wrote a treatise called Virginity that both borrows from Basil's treatise and diverges from it. Both these writers say that true virginity involves not just virginity in body, but even more virginity of the soul. It seems like they would start with some shared cultural vocabulary for what bodily virginity means in everyday society, and then add spiritual and soul-related ideas on top of that. But they discuss bodily virginity in surprisingly different ways. While both think their audience knows that virgins don't get married or sexually active, Basil sees bodily virginity as an absence of passionate pleasure in the body. Gregory sees it as a dedication of one's bodily life to eternal things instead of temporary ones. So for Basil of Ankara, sexual contact is not the fundamental issue. What corrupts virgins is the experience of sexual pleasure or other surges of excitement that shake up the body, much as vices like jealousy shake up the soul. Virgins are supposed to practice tranquility, avoiding the turbulence strong feelings for soul or body can immediately cause for soul and body. Physical virginity apparently here means maintaining the right physiology for a life of renunciation, the right bodily physics of sensations and responses. In Gregory of Nyssa's works, bodily virginity means something else. Humans are faced with two different orders of reality. One, the mortal world of constant change with its cycles of birth, growth, death, and decay. And the other, an immortal realm of incorruptibility. Virgins choose the immortal reality over the mortal one, devoting their bodies not to ordinary earthly life, but to a better life to come that can already break into the here and now. They turn away from bodily passions to seek pleasure in God. The power of death is halted as a virgin forsakes the path of marriage and children that ends in loss and grief, and chooses fuller participation in God's unchanging stability. These meanings for bodily virginity contrast with each other and with others' formulations. For example, Ephraim of Nisibis wrote 4th century Syriac hymns about Mary and about vowed virgins that give two more pictures. Ambrose of Milan's works have an early stage where bodily virginity is a general purity for the whole body, and a later stage where bodily virginity includes an intact hymen or similarly sealed off organs. Writers' various statements that virginity is something Christians acquire or something people innately have and guard, that virginity is powerful or fragile, restorable or irrecoverable, do not line up in predictable ways in these texts. Virginity of the body becomes not a concept we already recognize, but a phrase to decode and explore. Second to last topic is agendas. This one is briefer. With lengthy text, scholars can fruitfully investigate writers' agendas. For example, long Christian treatises are not just descriptive, but highly prescriptive, laying out goals and instructions for doing virginity right. You can hear writers' efforts to change community behaviors and carve out social space for insiders in a society of religious outsiders. There are clues that bishops and priests in emerging church hierarchies were competing for authority against theological opponents, spiritually impressive hermits, and leaders of radical ascetic groups, and that it helped to have virgins on one side. Strife at imperial borders or uncertainty over group boundaries could energize reflection on bodily purity and protection. Late ancient Christian debates about celibacy, Mariology, and Christology probably added momentum to the rise of hymenal thinking. Finally, fruitful work on virginity can take the form of speculation. I'm going to share this one more time. What many readers today wish to get beyond agendas or regulations or community ideals is a window into the lives of ordinary people. What did women think, say, and do about virginity norms of their day? What did lower class spouses actually expect for one another's sexual histories? How often were tests for virginity or penalties for virginity loss enacted? And who used the late ancient re-virginizing recipes that were designed for other purposes? Well-informed guesses can be an important part of feminist historical work. While some types of scholarly argument or argumentation avoid speculating, other types embrace the potential of knowledgeable, imaginative labor. There are two situations that have especially grabbed my attention in sources and that raise questions to prompt fruitful speculation. The sources probably come from the early 390s, one from Verona in northern Italy and one from Antioch in Syria. In a lengthy letter, Ambrose advises a fellow Italian bishop not to request a virginity inspection for a virgin whose name I'll pronounce Indicia. This consecrated virgin, who is a friend of Ambrose's sister, had been accused of having sex. Her bishop apparently wanted to put rumors to rest with a test by a midwife. While Ambrose shows elsewhere that he did subscribe to anatomical beliefs about virginity by this time, he vehemently objects to genital examination in this letter. He describes it as a shameful, shocking practice that threatens the very modesty it's meant to certify. He says medical authorities don't agree whether tests are reliable, and that even skilled, trustworthy midwives might reach conflicting results. He endorses traditional verification methods, like whether a girl is pregnant and the testimony others give about her character. Ambrose makes 3 references to enslaved women in the letter. He opposes the plan to use the services of a midwife who is a slave, as quite a few healthcare providers were. He reports a recent case where a slave underwent 2 virginity inspections and the midwives gave conflicting verdicts or ended up unsure of her status. And he says not to use measures that are used with enslaved people who are motivated by fear of punishment for free people who are motivated by pursuit of virtue. The unanswered questions here are numerous. Did Indicia undergo an inspection after all? An angry follow-up letter suggests she may have, but the situation is not clear. What became of the slave from the case Ambrose cites, and why did anyone want to verify her virginity in the first place? Were slaves in many late ancient households expected to live virginally despite having very little control over sexual exploitation of their bodies? How did the new task of virginity inspection benefit enslaved, freed, and free midwives in their work as healthcare practitioners? The other example is a picture painted by John Chrysostom in Syria. In treatises on virginity and celibacy, John discourages a popular practice where celibate women and men lived together in a non-sexual relationship. One treatise mentions the availability of virginity tests by midwives and insists that these tests do not sufficiently prove virginity. Real virginity entails purity in one's mind and actions, which a midwife cannot assess. John says with clear exaggeration that midwives are running to virgins' homes every day to see who is corrupted and who is not. Behind this picture lurks the outline of realistic situations. While many women in many different contexts have found vaginal virginity exams painful, traumatic, frightening, or humiliating, one would expect ancient experiences to be diverse, much as experiences are diverse today. It's possible some women did view tests as a helpful option for keeping their reputation intact. John's wording suggests that other people sometimes required tests to be performed for a particular virgin. Yet he implies, or maybe fears, that some virgins would like to request exams themselves so they can keep living with a celibate partner in peace. There's no way to know if this is just his worry of what could happen, or a way of covering bases in his argument, or if it could also be a clue that some virgins volunteered for routine testing. The brief passage suggests possible advantages of that new common sense for virgins cohabiting with men and for midwives employed to inspect them. Some women may have welcomed the chance to prove their status, defying critical church leaders in the process. With so little preserved of late ancient women's own words or views, informed speculation is a challenging but crucial opportunity. These are some of the areas and contours in the ongoing study of ancient and late ancient virginity. Above all, the past several decades of scholarship show that virginity is a malleable concept. It has many definitions, many uses or functions, and many twists and turns in its historical story. Exploring it requires setting aside our sense that we already know what it means and searching for what else it can mean. Virginity varies and takes new surprising forms across history and today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really, really great. So we're here in our last 10 minutes, and I've actually gotten a number of questions. So I don't want to waste too much time. And I want to just kind of jump in. And there was actually two really interesting questions, and they're getting the same point. And so two individuals that have reached out and asked, when we read the infancy gospel of James, which you probably kind of saw coming, someone kind of pointed out and made the question, and I'll read the quote here that said, and Salome said, as the Lord my God lives, unless I insert my finger and investigate her, I will not believe that a virgin is given birth. And the midwife in this infancy gospel responds and says, Mary, position yourself. For not a small test concerning you is about to take place. When Mary heard these things, she positioned herself, and Salome inserted her finger into her body, and cried out and said, woe for my lawlessness, and the unbelief that made me test the living God. Look, my hand is falling away from me and being consumed in fire. And I think in this quote alone, there's so many topics that you kind of organize in your outline, kind of coming together in a single confluence here. So maybe your kind of thoughts on that.
Absolutely, yeah. So the first thing I ever published was a long article in the Journal of Early Christian Studies about this text. So the long answer would be the article, which is in a 2016 issue of the Journal of Early Christian Studies. But a shorter version of the answer I think I can give here. The way that this scene is usually translated and interpreted assumes that midwives were already doing this, that midwives already were thinking about virginity in a hymenal kind of way, and that this is like checking if Mary still has proof of never having had sex or never having had any vaginal penetration. I think that that's anachronistic for this second century Greek text. I think what's actually happening here more likely is that we're seeing a midwife and then Salome, who seems to also know a thing or two about bodies. We're seeing them come and be witnesses to something a little different, a sort of different meaning for virginity than what most of us have expected to find. So earlier in the story, it's already been well established that Mary is sexually virginal. At this stage of the story, I think it's sharing that she is also reproductively virginal in a way other human women don't get to be. She is virginal in the sense that even though she just birthed Christ, her body looks like a non-mother. It looks like a woman who has not been through pregnancy and childbirth. So this is something that does get developed more in later texts. And it's the thing that I do think is starting surprisingly early here. The idea that her body looks virginal in terms of childbirth, which is actually a phrase that someone else uses in patristic writings too. So here the point is not something like testing, looking for a hymen. It's that midwives are the exact experts you would bring in to have someone talk about fertility and whether this body looks like someone who has had an ordinary childbirth as opposed to something more miraculous having happened.
I see, I see. And just on that point, I actually had my own question here that I think this is a great time to put it out there. One of the points that you made was that, as we've kind of moved forward in our understanding of medicine and the sciences, we know that the hymen kind of can have the ability to regrow or kind of repair itself or look different. It might not just be kind of a binary on and off like appearance when you see someone. Are there any testimonies or any writing where someone kind of did an examination, because this is something that was done, where maybe the hymen presented itself in one way and then it looked different in another way? I mean, obviously, I think that the case in point that I might be trying to get at is, do you see it where, okay, we came to the conclusion that someone is not a virgin, but then we come back and there's a secondary examination and, oh, a virgin reborn, and that I think has levels of spirituality and kind of there are things that could be said about something about that. So I'm just curious if I'm making stuff up already.
Well, one thing I just want to make sure I know is, are you asking more about ancient imagery or more about modern actual instances medically? Because those do exist.
Oh, no. I know those exist, absolutely. I mean,
Okay.
it's ancient literature. I mean, this
Okay.
exists. We know that now, but I'm not sure it's something that we could say that they knew then. So in the
Right.
context of divinity, how do we kind of understand this in that context where a hymen might present itself differently in one examination and then another one, and have people, I mean, this seems like something that an ancient writer in the 4th century would maybe go to town about writing about if this was the case. So I'm just curious if there's any case like that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I was at first thinking of earlier kinds of restored virginity that aren't necessarily about how tissue appears or anything. Things that are about like Hera or other goddesses, these sort of like festivals or rituals that have to do with sort of renewals of virginal, like there's virginity themes, in earlier mythology. But for these kinds of situations in late antiquity, I mean, it takes so long for people to start believing in hymens that by the time they're there, people are mostly, using language from the Bible about like opened, closed wombs. They're mostly getting kind of on-off switch about it by the time that they're employing it. And the folks who would call it into question don't really tell us what is so slippery and uncertain about the test. We do get like Ambrose or a couple other folks who are opposing these things. I mean, even earlier, Cyprian, he's one of our really unusually early outliers. He actually talks about enlisting midwives for tests, but he doesn't think it's a technique or idea. He still, for some reason, says to do it anyway. But he also says, yeah, there's a lot that you can't tell about real virginity from this. And I think that he, as well as Ambrose, cast some doubt, if I'm remembering right, on like how much a midwife really can tell anyway. Ambrose really says a lot about that. But yeah, I don't recall places where folks have started believing in hymens and also have noticed times when things change. I think it's doing important conceptual work for them by the time it's invented, and they're probably not looking for exceptions to the rule at that point.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's something that I think would kind of be interesting if it was noticed. But again, you can't really take photographs, or the level of detail that would need to be seen over like a period of time might be different as opposed to kind of a medical setting today. Yeah, absolutely. And then I did have one more question, and this kind of brings us back to a broader picture here. So the idea of virginity and kind of its discussion over the course of history is something that isn't novel to Christianity. I mean, by really kind of any stretch of the imagination. But as early Christian communities are growing and diverging in the first few centuries there, how how well does Christianity kind of define virginity against its Jewish background, right? So this is something that exists in Judaism. Early Christian communities are developing. We see a kind of diversity of communities appearing. Do we see some type of really distinguishing through line in these communities that we can say this is, canonically Christian. This allows us to create, a line in our history record.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as you probably heard in what I was sharing, the thing I'm usually more struck by are the continuities or possible overlaps. But it
Mhm.
is true that there's some things that are overall, generally distinctive between some of these religious communities. The clearest one would just simply be that you get a lot more enthusiasm about celibacy and asceticism and lifelong virginity in various Christian groups than you do in most Jewish groups. Usually, as things are sort of evolving through late antiquity and various ways to be Christian and ways to be Jewish are, which sometimes are overlapping, right, are increasingly defining themselves over against each other. One of the ways that seems to look is having such different attitudes about traditional fertility and like whether procreation is still a sort of God-given command that people need to be continuing to follow on a large scale. So it becomes a sort of dividing point in that respect. But a lot of the other conceptual things going on, I think there's some overlap with what's happening with imaginations about like physically what I call virginity taking flesh, kind of incarnate like Christ in this time. There's also some overlap in concerns about group boundaries, about ways that violence against a Jewish minority or a Christian minority in a larger world, ways that really animates something fascinating in how like virgin martyrs are so important, or in how protection, sexual protection, right, of vulnerable captive Jews. There's a lot of, I think, common sort of political things happening there. And then at the same time, some of the really rich theological veins in the two different traditions are going to naturally kind of evolve differently from each other.
Yeah, yeah. It's always interesting how you kind of have this one major concept, and the way it kind of grows or blooms, as you're saying, is really interesting, especially from kind of like a diachronic perspective. But yeah, that's perfect. So again, we only have 15 minutes for Q&A, and I just need to take a moment and thank you so much for joining us tonight. This was an incredible lecture. Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me.